Geneva. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Today is a great day for all of us. But before we proceed, I would like to pay respect to the indigenous of Australia, the past, the present, and the future. We would also like to acknowledge our martyrs back home. The history is theirs. And today is a day also we remember them. So we thank you for coming in. I would like also to say my name, because people may ask me, who is this person? My name is Gabriel Levin. I'm one of the organizers, partner with African World Book. I have Charles, John. In case I need help, you can see them. Charles is over there, and John Manuel, I think, has not come in. Before we proceed, we would also like to acknowledge the presence of our guests, distinguished guests, and the community leaders. As I just mentioned, today is a good day for all of us. The African World Book, our partners, those community-based organizations, and also the friends of South Sudanese. We thank you so much. And I would like not to waste much of time in one way or another. You may know our guests today. Our authors, the artists, are with us today. We have those who are knowledgeable in Sudan, South Sudan, and also the South Sudanese Australians that are here today. And I would like to mention to you those who will be with us today, because they will have their own biography at some stage later. So we have Arok Alew. He's the new artist, but also dedicated himself to the custom, traditions, and language. He has written about Dinka language, and we think is that a great thing. We also have John Deng. John Deng has written about his personal account, and quite frankly, I have not read his book. I can't wait also to put my hand on. But we believe he touches on our life and political issues that affect us as South Sudanese. We have Sarah. She did an assessing work of South Sudanese in Australia. And it's a great opportunity for us to have her, a person who is knowledgeable on us, and take observation. So thank you. And as all of you know, or may not know, we have Dr. Douglas H. Johnson, who is knowledgeable on Sudan, South Sudan, and I believe part of Northeast Africa. He is a historian, and he was a member of a BI Boundary Commission. He also was a consultant on Sudan peace talk. We left to our best nation, South Sudan now. So he is with us today. Many of you read his books. I'm not going to go into. He will say some later on, and somebody who will say his biography will come on. But he has written assessing work. He's a living historian for us as South Sudanese. Thank you for being with us. We have Professor Dr. Wendy. It's very amazing that we have two couples who have devoted themselves on Sudan and also work along Kordofan she also looked at the minorities, and I believe she did some work on voodoo, and we have, she written some books, and I hope they will be judged. So it's good our friends from Kordofan are here, and the one, I think I'm not quite familiar with your name, I'm sorry, it's called Azen? Azen, yes. Azen also, his brother helped her translate her book into Arabic. So we're glad to have you today. Our guest of honor and a friend of South Sudanese, of which you may have heard his name. Some who have not seen him, Tim Kessler is with us today. I haven't met you, I have your name, but he has been advocate for the world mission, and he is the one also work on the issues of relief. Look, I believe somebody who has knowledgeable on you will also say some few things later on. This is a brief description. I'm not putting them into detail, but it's just to know them what their names are. And before we proceed, we have community-based organizations. African World Book, the president of African World Book is here. He's always a busy man. You may not see him like somebody who can sit and he's also doing some work. So Peter N, known Walrek, is the president of, or the chairman of African World Book. We also have Elizabeth Gardner, a friend of South Sudanese, but not only that, she is also the secretary of African World Book. So Elizabeth is here. People know that, yes. For South Sudanese, there are too many communities. It will be a waste of time instead of using wisely to listen to our horses. But just mention a few. We have South Sudanese community in Victoria. We have GM community in Victoria. We have South Sudanese Federation in Victoria. We have the GM, but I would also emphasize, Bon Masha, you can stand up. Bon is a dedicated, active man for our community as well. He's the chairman of GM in Victoria. So it's just to mention you. If I have not mentioned you, doesn't mean that you have not contributed. And it doesn't mean that you are so little. You have contributed in many ways, and that's why today is a successful day. And I thank you for that work. Now, I would like to welcome Elizabeth Gardner to say a few background about African World Books, and also to introduce Sarah, because Sarah, she has done some work here, so our guests can also know what is affecting us here or the impact we have here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. This is a very special occasion for Africa World Books because it was in this exact space that we launched the business 4 years ago, 2013. And since that time, the number of books that we have in our catalogue for sale has grown hugely, and the business is actually ticking over quite nicely, which is a great relief. And it's wonderful when people buy the books to see the excitement and the anticipation before they actually read it. And then, having read the books, there's such discussion, such intelligent conversations about our books. So we have a lot to owe to Peter Luau. He's an absolutely generous man with his time and his skills, and he's just an outstanding leader, and I'm very proud to work with him. So thank you for coming and supporting us today. And Now the second part of my task, happily, is to talk to you about Sarah Ma. Sarah is working at Monash University and has recently submitted her PhD and is now doing research about the Australian diaspora and their homeland. So that's going to be a very interesting book, which maybe we could snaffle up and publish that in time to come. That'd be lovely. So now we have Sarah to speak with us.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity today, but I would like to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we are gathered here today and pay respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to pay respects to elders in the room, in particular Wendy and Douglas and Aendit, who is also here. So I'm going to try and keep this brief, but I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about why I'm here. So my background, I'm going to show you some slides when those screens work. So my background is actually from, okay, so since about 2004 I worked in a refugee settlement in Melbourne. I had various roles and I put the information up there just to give a picture to those who aren't aware of those figures, just how significant the community is in Australia now, and particularly in Melbourne. In 2010 I went to Sudan and I returned in 2011, and that was a really formative experience for me. So in the first trip I met this woman. If you could do the next slide. So I'm sure there's some people here who know Victoria. When I spent time with her, she told me a lot about the war, but the thing that really stuck in my mind was about how much slavery occurred during the war. And that was something I had known nothing about. After working with the community for years here in Melbourne, I had never heard that story. So when I came back from Sudan, I decided that those kind of stories should be recorded. So I started a project called the Annual Project, and I went and interviewed as many women elders as I could. And there's about 32 hours of stories now recorded, and that has gone into the State Library of Victoria, where they will stay forever. The library was very happy to receive those recordings. They are going to be released online possibly next year when they start to put the oral archive available. So you'll just be able to go to your computers and stream the interviews. They've actually chosen that project to be the first of their very sizable oral archive to be released. So if you could just, yeah, so that's the Annual Project. That's the CD that we put together. After the Annual Project, mainly because of the things that the women talked about in those interviews, I decided that I needed to do more about it, so I went to Monash University to undertake a PhD. So the idea was to address how slavery had affected the community, and the plan was to do that fieldwork in South Sudan. The original idea was to go to, this was the title, and the fieldwork was going to be conducted in Twitch, Ariel and RBA. Unfortunately, the university decided that I could go, that they considered too high a risk. So the research was redesigned to be conducted in Melbourne. So this is what it became. And instead of looking specifically at slavery with those women, it became very broad. So it was to address the effect of a number of genocidal events. And it was for as inclusive as possible, so not just for Dinka women, for as many South Sudanese women as possible. When I submitted the draft, the thesis, this is what I submitted. So if you could do the next slide. No, if you go back one. Okay. One more. This one. Yep, that's it. Okay. So finally, the final thesis was about, looked at post-settlement. So the idea is that the community has been here for quite a long time now. So an average figure might be 10 or 12 years. So the question is, given what had happened prior to migration, how are women's lives like now? So some findings, and I won't go into it too much, but I'll just give you a few brief views. So if you skip over the next one. Okay, so one of the first findings is that low literacy is an incredibly serious problem within the community. This is carried over from settlement. So it's a situation that hasn't particularly changed. One of the reasons it is so significant is not so much the number of women who are affected by low literacy, but the effect of that. So for those who are facing perhaps a lifetime of dependency on government benefits, that's a highly stressful position to be in. So it's also means that they are effectively living under the poverty line, so that's also very stressful in trying to sustain families here and overseas. And also the compliance requirements of those on government benefits creates significant fear and anxiety. So that's one of the findings. The second one is, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, is the change in family functioning and the roles of women as parents. Probably the most difficult part of that is with young people, with teenagers, and the intergenerational conflict that can occur. And the last finding is an interesting thing that women who are dependent on government benefits live quite stressful lives and they don't feel particularly secure here, but other women do. So women have found in Australia safety and security after decades of insecurity. So it's had this interesting effect. One of them is that women were able to talk quite freely about sexual violence that had occurred during the war. That's extremely unusual. That they were able to do that, and they did that of their own volition, suggests that things have shifted for them, and it suggests it might also be the time to talk about those types of past events. The final point is that one of the ways that women were able to feel like they had a sense of belonging in Australia, or that they felt included, was their ability to access healthcare. So all different types of healthcare, often free, had a really significant contribution to their feeling of belonging in Australia. So the findings are what we would call a little paradoxical. Some feel safe and secure and included in Australia, and others don't. Okay, so that's the thesis and that's the findings. I'm just going to move on now to the project that I started immediately after having the thesis in. So if we could have the next slide. So the South Sudan Diaspora Impacts Project was put together, it's across several countries. If you could do the next slide. So the aim of it was to gather knowledge about the relationship between the Australian diaspora and their community in their home. So looking at positive and negative effects So very little is known or understood about what those relationships are. So, next slide. It's actually funded by the Australian Embassy in Ethiopia, and that embassy comes under the banner of Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, so known as DFAT. It's administered by the Rift Valley Institute, which is an extremely well-known agency in East Africa. Douglas has done much work with the RVI. It's managed by Dr. Nikki Kindersley, who did her research in South Sudan as well, and is now based in Cambridge. And there's two teams in Juba, Professor Rebecca Lawrence and Gabriel Kerr, who are at Juba University, and here, myself and Dr. Santino Attending, who unfortunately can't be here today because he has gone back to South Sudan to visit. So the methods that we use to find out or examine these questions in Juba, they held 3 focus groups. They also conducted individual interviews with people who had some connection with Australia. Either they had lived here themselves or they had family here. And there were also multiple questionnaires conducted across the university. In Melbourne, we also had 2 focus groups. There will be a 3rd at the end of January, and we will also conduct individual interviews. So the process is not quite finished. So just these are very early comments. We have a lot of data. It's not been organised yet. We haven't collected it all. But just to give you a bit of a picture of some of the things that are coming up. One of them is this, that there is this really fundamental question in Juba and in Melbourne about what it is to be South Sudanese and who has the right to make a contribution, particularly politically. Who gets to decide how South Sudan is governed? And this is a point that came up very strongly, both in Juba and in Melbourne. So that's the first one. So the second one is that the diaspora, they support multiple different types of actions. So local plan focused, lots of development work. I'm sure all of you have some involvement in that at some point. Also ethnic, national politics, efforts to westernise the civil service, and efforts to reform and develop civil society. So these have been identified by both the diaspora here and in Juba. The next finding is it's not really possible to separate out diaspora political life from South Sudan in general. So it seems like it's better to understand Sudan's politics as a kind of global thing and not something that belongs solely in South Sudan. In Australia, the Australian government is influenced internally by Australian people, but in South Sudan, politics and government are influenced by multiple different populations around the world where the diasporas are located. And so the last point is, and this is a pretty significant one, I think, and I'm sure it comes as no surprise, and is that social media is used by the Australian diaspora constantly to discuss political events in South Sudan. The key questions are how do they get received and understood, how are they verified and passed on in South Sudan. So the data has shown that people do what we call cross-referencing. So somebody sees something on some social media, maybe Facebook, maybe radio, they call someone in South Sudan, they say, what's happening? And that person says, I don't know. And so you go and check somewhere else. People talked about trying to check information on Al Jazeera, Sudan Tribune, BBC, Radio Tanjung, and so on. But you get this, what we call a feedback loop. So it goes round and round. And sometimes people can't say where something started. They saw it on Facebook, or someone in Juba told them, or they heard it some other way. Someone's rung them. Sometimes people in South Sudan ring people in the diaspora to find out what's happening in South Sudan. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and it's quite complicated. So I'm going to stop there. When we finish this research, there'll be a lot more information available. We'll give a much more clearer picture of what the findings are overall, and there'll certainly be more than what I just presented there. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Sarah, for that great work. I hope we have seen something. Thank you. Before we proceed, I know the time is running, but I also would like to make some acknowledgement. Those I would have mentioned in the beginning. We have with us today one of the special guests with us, Professor Jenny Addison. Jenny, if you can, is a former Melbourne University art history professor. So thank you for being with us. Atem is not with us, Honorable Atem, but his book is here today. But we will have somebody who will briefly talk about his book or abstract. Oh, thank you for that. As I mentioned already, many of you know Tim by name, and if you have not seen him, lucky today we have him. So he's advocate for the World Vision, and we all know the work of World Vision. We thank you for being with us again. Thank you. Now, because of the time, I would love, I'm not dictating, but I would love those who are coming to be in between 15. If there is much, you need to emphasize at least minimum of 20 minutes. Maximum, but minimum of 15. So, John Day, we will not ask other people to come and introduce you. You will briefly talk about yourself and briefly, objectively on your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'm a foreigner here, so nobody knows me. I'm from Queensland. My name is John Ding, as he said. I'm a South Sudanese, Australian. I came from Brisbane, Queensland. To start with, on the onset of this gathering, I first acknowledge the custodian of the land on which we have gathered, our first Australians. I pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and the future. And secondly, I thank the African World Books and through CEO Peter Malrage for the cordial invitation for me to be here. This organization and this publisher is a thriving company. They started from a small and it is growing quite rapidly. I thank the team that is behind this for the dedications and giving their time to grow this publisher. I always support the African World Books because we came from a theoretical background where things are told from the elders. The elder in our community is a living dictionary. And when we lost him, the dictionary is banned or dictionary is not there. It has been swept away by a flood. So we lost information. And I think African World Book, if I'm not wrong, is the first of its kind of a South Sudanese publisher in the modern contemporary society. So I thank the World Books and those by this organization. I guess the goal of African World Book is to bring knowledge and to keep knowledge within our community. Thirdly, our thanks, take this opportunity to thank our great men, our historians, Dr. Douglas Johnson, who have actually worked so hard to keep our history, keep our stories, keep our custom, and he's been very instrumental in a lot of negotiations, as somebody alluded before. He was in the IBA's issues when they were discussing the border, and he had been providing groundwork on the CP as well in terms of history. I thank him so much for always dedicating his time to the people of Sudan, the people of South Sudan in particular. And I wish that our dear God keep him around, as we will take from him from there, to make sure that we have a history recorded. Fourthly, it's about my roots. Of course, the idea of where does book come from? In my thinking, book comes from our mind. They don't descend from heavens. They come from our mind, they come from our thinking, they come from observations, they come from experiences, they come from what things we really think about as so much important to us. Or they come from the love to keep the story around, even before and after you've gone. So, as part of that, it came to my mind that as we have the privilege and opportunity to be in this country, where we have the best opportunities to explore, we have opportunities to use, so much potential to tap into. It came to my mind that instead of writing a piece of commentaries, I need to put something down. And who knows, it will stay forever. Because when you've written a book, it stays even after you've gone. So it came to my mind that let me just think about what can I really write about. So my book title, as some of you might have read or have seen it, is entitled The Politics of Ethnicity and Government in South Sudan. Subtitle is Understanding the Complexity of the WENDY country. The two concepts that are explored in these books, small books, is ethnicity and government. And these are the core when we talk about our politics in South Sudan. And these are the things that affect us so much, as Sarah noted in our findings. South Sudanese diaspora are integral and parcel part of what's happening in Juba. We are daily consumers of politics in Juba. It affects us daily. We sleep with it. So it came to my mind that let me put something down about this and leave it there. Someone might read it, or someone might use it. And that's the role of the intellectual. Before going there, maybe I will need to say my brief background. I came to Australia almost 12 years ago. I've been to university several times, graduated with a couple of degrees, including 3 masters. I'm now a research student on the area of education. I'm married, I have 6 kids, beautiful children. My daughter is now in high school. So on the 2 concepts that I wrote about, governance and ethnicity, I understood ethnicity is the reality we have in a country. We are very diverse. We have 64 tribes in a country. And these 64 tribes have different cultures and customs. They even have different languages. So it's a very diverse society. So how do you manage that diversity? Has it been a cause of conflicts? Or has it actually reaching our unity? The second concept is governance. South Sudanese have never had a country of their own. So governing a country is a new thing to us. And that's why we have challenges, so I won't brief you about it. On the first concept of synchronicity, my few first chapters talk about the positive role that synchronicities played when we had a war. And some of you could remember, those who were young or when they're grown up, that the war of liberation in South Sudan was actually fought by synchronicities, or by the communities, by tribe. And I remember very well that they were using our ship, Salatin. The modalities to get the army was either conscription, you are opposed to the army, whether you like it or not, or you voluntarily have the conviction to go and fight because you want independence of your country. Or when there were nobody that volunteered themselves, or the people that can contribute to the army, then they had a modality called distribution plan through Salatin. So they would come and say, from this area, we need 3-5 men to join the army. These people were distributed and contributed by the communities. So the war that got us into CPA, which actually got us into independence, was fought by our ethnicities. Our tribe were all part of the war. There were those active in the field, there were those that were not. So ethnicities was very positive in our situation when we fought the war. And it was a modality that brought us to have independence. The negative part of ethnicity that I've alluded to is that it is now being used as a source of division. It has become a chronic issue. It has been used now to mobilize people to back up a general or particular society. So in other words, what was good for us is now being misused at the very time when we really need this unity. That's why you could see this element, for example, with Kubai. It is an ethnic, notorious concept that should be condemned. You have this issue called White Army. It has a very, very specific project that has nothing to do with other ethnicities, but only with their ethnicities. I remember when one of them was interviewed by the BBC as to, when you're fighting this, you the White Army, where is this war taking to you to? The chairman of the White Army said, we will stop this war when our brother, our elder, Dr. Yemwacha, is actually installed into presidency. When we see him in the White House, or J1, or we may call it J2, when he's there, we would not leave the fight. These are notorious elements of negative ethnicities. Also, you have what we call JCE, which has lost the objective. Gen Council elders, commenting on political issues. They're supposed to be a custodians of cultures and tradition of our culture, as some of his writing it. They should be dealing with how they should unify their languages, unify their marriages, practices, and actually their custom, and how they should engage with other tribes in terms of their custom and intermarriages. This should be all of their council elders. It should not be to abide the president. Because there are institutions in place that are there to abide the president. Presidential is an institutional thing. It never been a tribal thing in a contemporary world. So these are elements, and also we have the Noel Council. We have the Equatorial Council of Life, that was headed by the late professor, actually focusing on how they can bring up the Equatorians and complaining that their land is being grabbed and all that. These are negative ethnicity that have penetrated society at the moment. So my books talk about such things. On the other side, and I also said this, I put a chronology of the ethnicities, the war that came as a result of ethnicities, and I put a profile of, Grand conflict versus Gaitut, which was taken over by, and Grand conflict versus the Mashar, and Dr. Machar conflict, Dr. Machar versus Salva Kiir. These are contemporary conflicts that have the engines, the tribal affiliations. So I talked first about how good our tribe are really good and how bad it is being used now, with use to divide us. On the area of government, not to bore you a lot, in 2087, I've just put more pressure on good governance. This is what we are applying for, and I put a diagram there. You'll see in page 87. Good governance in contemporary world is defined as the government that has consensus or consensus-oriented, the government that is accountable, transparency in resource distributions, the government that applies the rule of law without favoritism, a government that has equitable and inclusivity of all the people, a government that is responsible. You see what happens most of the time when some tribe fight. It takes days for the government to actually act and to prevent that. It's not responsive in that context. And sometimes we have these confusions. We have the state governments. And sometimes we will see the governor of the state complaining that, Juba is supposed to solve the problem. But the governor in the state, in their constitution, is the chairman of the security of the state. And he has the division of the army in the state. That is another. So they fail to do their action, then they will always say, Juba is not doing this for us. Go to the commissioners. The commissioners have a number of army in this area and police forces. It's not using it, but whenever an incident happens, they will say Juba is a problem. So there's a lot of confusions. So the government is not responsible in all levels. And by the way, we have 3 levels of government. We have central government, we have state government, and we have local governments. So, but the federal government would be considered as a good governance. So I find that principally of that part. As also part of good governance, I have suggested a number of things, what I call institutional reform as a recipe for reconstituting good governance. Okay. And I said what we could do with that. One of the things I mentioned, which is very controversial, is that SPLM must be abolished. Because it was an instrument of the war. Actually, SPLM was for everybody. It was for all of us. Because our objective was actually to liberate our country. And now we have achieved that. So the objective of that has collapsed. What we need now is governance. What we need now is good governance in the country. And we have to grow parties that have ideologies, contemporary ideologies, and ideologies that address the needs of the people. Okay? That's what, but now our people are used to SPLM as the only thing that could take us, but it has lost objective. That's why you see they're fighting, and they even divide, and they even create more SPLM, DC, SPLM, FT, SPLM, DC, because it's what people know. And this has shown us also that liberation movements don't govern well after independence. They don't govern well. They have to disfigure. Look at the Kanu in Kenya and other countries. So it is one of my suggestions that it should become our national, we own it, all of us. It's a memorable thing for all of us. We fought using this tool, and now let's go to participatory democracy, where parties should grow up with ideologies. And I should also choose a party that aligns with what I think is a good vision. I should not choose a party because my ex and trial man is there leading. So we have to go to that. Yeah. I also expounded a little bit, just the last one. Okay. Just one thing in page 70 that I want to say something briefly in 1 minute. This is where we talk about fair state. The narrative of failed state. The failed state index is considered that a country that don't do the following, or don't have the following, is already a failed state. You don't need to argue. People argue in Germany, even ministers that been to university. They argue that we are not a failed state. Then what are we? If we don't provide services that the state is supposed to do, we are automatically a failed state. Whether we are born today, whether we were born yesterday, we are failed state because the state is not delivering what the state should do. So, if state have refugees and IDPs, it is a failed state. If it has uneven economic development, some areas are developed, some areas are not, it's a failed state. If it has human rights issues, people are killing people by what they know as gunmen, it's a failed state. There's no state that people could be killed in its capital city. It's a failed state. So you can read that in page 17. I know the team is going, and I have to give them the opportunity. Brothers and sisters, I would encourage you to read books. I would encourage you to write books. We are not waiting for anybody to come and write for us. We are grown up, we have been to universities. What else are you waiting? Let's write our history, let's record our things. Let's be engaged with our people, of course, in a very positive way. I thank you for reading some of the books that you already have. I wish you to support African Well Books. And also, I would like to thank you so much for cordial and after listening. Thank you very much.
That's a part of issue, and it's very difficult sometimes, to condense the personal account, and that's the part. I believe the other speakers, if we can work hard, just say something brief, objective, and the rest we'll find in the book. Now, my understanding is that Tim was here for 1 hour. 1 hour has gone. But we will not say it's because of not Kawaja time. There's another local term we have, and Dr. Douglas is aware of that term. But I may call you, say a few words to us, and thank for your time.
Thank you. I am honoured to be here and in the presence of the other speakers, given their calibre and scholarship and their passion. I might say that my job takes me all around the world, but I particularly have a burden in my heart for South Sudan. I love South Sudanese people. I feel great grief at what is going on in South Sudan now. And I know that Big Dipper ride of extraordinary joy with independence, and now wondering where the bottom of the trough of that Big Dipper ride is going to be. How long, oh Lord, can this suffering go on? That you must be feeling the grief far greater than I feel. I will be there in Juba next month looking at our work. I was in Bidi Bidi, northern Uganda in April, May of this year. 1 million South Sudanese now fleeing the ethnic tribal violence in Bidi Bidi. What really caused me great emotional stress and distress was the number of unaccompanied children whose parents literally had said, just follow the columns of suffering humanity, adults, and follow them. And when I was there, we'd already registered 14,000 unaccompanied children who had no idea if their parents were alive or dead, who were dazed, confused, didn't know where they were, had just followed the columns of suffering humanity. World Vision, with other agencies, is there in Bidi Bidi camp. Thank God for the Ugandan government. Thank God the Ugandan government is not like the Australian government. The Ugandan government hasn't closed the border. The Ugandan government has allowed people to come to get some land, some tools, to let us care for people after registration, unaccompanied children into foster families. I've just come back from Manus Island. I was in Canberra this week with our Prime Minister, our Leader of the Opposition, our Immigration Minister, Mr Dutton, saying, how can we allow people whose only sin was that they came by boat to now be going through psychological torture 5 years on, up there on Manus Island, part of New Guinea, in the fiction that this is stopping the boats. How long in anyone's moral universe do you psychologically torture people to maintain a political fiction that it stopped the boats? Thankfully, the Ugandan government hasn't done that. I was so impressed with their openness and their welcome. Well, the ongoing tragedy of South Sudan plays heavily on my mind. You're here to discuss what can be done, and it has to begin here. It has to begin with Dinka and Nua and Equatorian Zata groups saying, enough. Enough. We will not be part of inflaming tensions, whether through social media or for whatever else. Enough. This suffering has to stop. When I think about World Vision's work, it is really two bits. There is hardware and there is software. Hardware is what people really in Australia give us money to do. They think this is development. It's money for a water well, for a school, for a health clinic, for an economic livelihoods project. That's how Australians think about poverty. We'll give you money because we're rich and these people are poor, and if we transfer some money to them, they call that development. Now that's important. What's much more important in the work we do is software. Software is actually getting in deep into the culture and relationships, and where it is appropriate, because this is always debatable, trying to rewrite, refigure the software, men's attitudes toward women. People say, well, what right do we have to do that? It's their culture. Our right is that I believe in my Christian faith, women are made in the image of God with just the same rights as men. Girls have just the same right to education and to fulfill their potential as men. Yes, I might be called colonial for having that view interfering with the culture, but World Vision says that's part of our work. Challenging software is challenging the attitudes of clans to their greater tribe, of tribes to other tribe, where it almost becomes a virtue to hate them, to blame them, to never forgive for what's gone in the past. Challenging software is recognizing that we humans are a mystery to ourselves. There's part of us that's about soul, empathy, compassion, imagining what would it be like if that was happening to me. The other part of our human nature is predatory, greedy, cruel, standing on the shoulders of others and pushing them down, having power and whatever goods flow from aid, oil, whatever, just for our family, our clan, our group. Without empathy, without compassion. We know, and the former speaker was talking about this, that you can't create a nation just with an election and running a flag up the pole. Don't we know that now? You have to create institutions, rule of law, that check human nature that wants to be corrupt and greedy, free press. Human rights. Human rights at the end of the day are just about human relationships. Human rights come because we actually see another person is like us. They are human, and we empathise. What would it be like if I was a minority? If I was being treated because they're a smaller tribe or on the wrong side of the cattle stealing, whatever the issue might be, and therefore I have a right to use my power over them and smash them. Human rights come out of human relationships. In Christian faith, we believe that when God became human in Jesus, it means everything that is human is comfortable with God. There is nothing that's human that's alien to God. There is nothing in my faith that says because I'm white, people who are black are alien. I remember a South Sudanese woman saying to me, this is interesting. There was a movie going on and there was a few of us watching it, and she just said, I don't trust white men. Black men are good. And then I thought about my culture. How many in my culture say we whites don't trust black men, right? Culture is very deep. It's a default setting. It's instinctive. We don't even think. The prejudices creep in. Men's attitudes to girls. Tribes' attitudes to other tribes. Part of me says South Sudan now has to become good at forgetting and forgiving. We often say yes, but we've got to know the history, and I read Douglas's books and the history. But history can often feed the identity, this was done to us. These people hurt us. There are sometimes we need to forget history because it just makes us feel victims and angry and wanting revenge. We need to forget. Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, there is no future without forgiveness. We don't just need to forget, we need to forgive. There is no future without forgiveness. Well, World Vision's work will go on being hardware. Our work, $50 million program in South Sudan, in the refugee camps, doing what we can. But the more important work's the software. How do we actually build reconciliation? We know what happened in Rwanda in 1994, don't we? We know what happened. 1 million died in 8 weeks, more systematic and efficient than the Nazi killing machine, and it was machetes mainly. We know where the old gods of blood and tribe and soil, just my soil, lead to. In the West, they led to 2 world wars when we serve those gods, when we can't forget and we can't forgive. But we also know, as the last speaker said, we've got to build institutions that check that part of the human nature that is greedy and exploitative and corrupt and oppresses women and oppresses weaker tribes. We know we have to build that in South Sudan. I'm committed to that. World Vision's committed to that. But the real challenge is we have to do it here in Melbourne and in Australia. Do you agree? We have to begin here and pilot and model and get on social media and show that we're forgetting and we're forgiving. We actually need that influence to change the storyline that goes on and on and on. Well, I've talked about Christian faith. Let me talk about one of the fathers of the Enlightenment. He was a very clever German man called Immanuel Kant. And he said, any moral law has to be universalized. The rights I want for myself, I have to give those rights to someone else. He said, humans are never an end in themselves. Sorry, humans are never a means to an end. Humans are an end in themselves. I discussed Immanuel Kant with Peter Dutton this week, our immigration minister. I don't know if Peter Dutton understood anything I was saying, but I had this discussion with him. I said, you're using the people up on Manus Island as means to an end. You're using them to send a message to people smugglers, don't try and come, and people to get on boats to Australia. You're locking them up with psychological torture and uncertainty to send a message. For a start, the message is nonsense. Boats are always trying to come to Australia. If they're not smuggling people, they're smuggling drugs. What stops boats coming is our naval defence. The ring of steel is called that turns them back. Secondly, it's wrong to use people's pain as if they're just a means to send a message. These people I met 2 weeks ago on Manus Island are ends in themselves. The children I saw alone, arriving at Biddy Biddy, confused, distraught, not understanding why they had to flee, are ends in themselves. This has to stop. We have to start both forgetting and forgiving, and it has to start here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As we have heard, the time is against us. I would emphasize. The next two speakers are going to be limited to 10 minutes. But I do know they are also short. I mean, they speak short rather than long. So before I call Alo, I will call Garan Kwur on behalf of Atem to read briefly about what Atem has written or his bio. That would be less than 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. I've been timed, and I will try to be very efficient and very fast. All I wanted to do was a very brief preview of what it is in the book, and I was hoping that Honorable Tim would be here today to talk more about the book himself, and but that role has now come to me. So I think for the sake of clarity, I would request Gabriel to allocate that time that he wanted Tim to speak to myself as well. So make it 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Distinguished guest, Dr. Douglas Ed Jensen, and Professor Wendy, Team Costello, and presenting authors, the Reverend John Adore and Roger Lewa. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to this spectacular book launch. I've been asked to provide a preview of the Jungle Chronicles by Temayaga Tim. On the outset, I must mention that I'm not a linguist, a journalist, a literary expert, so the review I'm going to offer is by no means an expert review. I'm a medical scientist by training and skills at things under the microscope. It is a great occasion for all of us, the authors and other audience. I commend the team at the African World Books for the wonderful work they are doing despite some challenges. We should all applaud Mr. Peter Warai for founding this publisher, the African World Books. He is an energetic, visionary and hard-working young person. Congratulations to him and his team. The work Peter Wall and his team is doing is a great service to South Sudan. We are really greatly privileged to have in our midst an eminent historian, Dr. Douglas H. Johnson. His numerous books, The Root Causes of Sudan Civil War, The Upper Nile Government, Governing the Nuer and the Empire and the Nuer, when borders become boundaries, and Nuer prophets. And the book, the new book we are launching today, South Sudan, a new history for a new nation, have extensively documented our troubled history. And I believe if Dr. Johnson hadn't been bestowed a South Sudanese citizenship, then he deserved it more than any other foreign person. You are a Sudanese, honorary or real. For over 4 decades, you've been a true friend of peoples of South Sudan who has painstakingly documented their history. South Sudan history will bear your name for posterity. About the author, Mr. Atim Yagatem. Uncle Atim Yagatem needs no introduction to an audience like today's gathering. He is a famed South Sudanese veteran journalist. His writings have inspired and continue to inspire generations of South Sudanese readers and writers alike. I have been one of his avid readers starting in the 1990s until now. I believe I speak for many people when I say we have patiently waited for this book for what appeared like eternity. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the book, The Jungle Chronicles. It's right here, and even when you want to buy it, please buy it right now. The content of this book means so much to me and many of my contemporaries. To review this book, I will offer what is essentially a personal view. For those who are familiar with the history of liberation struggle waged by the SPLM, you may recall that Atim Yagatem was the founding director of the powerful mouthpiece, the radio SPLM. Through this medium, Atim Yagatem and his team at the radio SPLM were deservedly praised. If you want to see an extended version of this prize, read a book by John Goren called For Democracy in Sudan. For waging a very fierce media war that catapulted SPLM into a international limelight. Mr. Atim, who led this unconventional battalion, was a successful war reporter. Actually doesn't want to be known as a war propagandist. When Atim Yagatem started writing a series of articles in a column entitled Far Away from War in the defunct SPLM update newsletter, his magnificent writing attracted many people, and of course, some for the wrong reasons. The stories, some of which he has reproduced in this book, were meant to give an alternative view to the dreary war reports contained in the newsletter. The Sudanese Civil War caused untold suffering and carnage through active combat or war-related death. In the column, Atim Yagatem attempted to portray an optimistic outlook and resilience of the Sudanese people. That despite the horrors of war in places far away from front lines, such as liberated areas or areas under SPLA control, in displaced people's camps, in the refugees camp, Sudanese people continue to live a life semblant of normal life. Marriages were celebrated, children were born, people went about their normal business despite the suffering occasioned by war. The far away from war column evolved into a narrative of its own, or rather a myth in some quarters. The popular readership or hearsay these stories engendered became stuff of a legend. Uncle Atim's names became intertwined with the column title to an extent others thought it was his nickname. Every time Atim Yagatem's name is mentioned in a conversation, an ignorantly coined appellation, the man far away from war, would be a common rejoinder. This group of people who would refer to Uncle Tim Yak as such included those who had never read the column. Others concorded on our language interpretation of what it meant to be far away from war, concluding that far away from war must refer to Tim's physical position in relation to war front. Hence, he was a man far away from war. At the time of his writing, he resided in Lodwar in northern Kenya. So the far away from war column somewhat evolved into the Chinese whispers story that get distorted with time. This in turn popularized the column. Tim Yak has provided in this book a generous explanation of these intriguing anomalies in the origins of far away from war. Please see page 226. For over 40 years, Tim has written very many articles and edited several magazines such as the Southern Sudan Magazine, The Pioneer, the SPLM Update, Horn of Africa Vision, and Sudan Mirror, among many others. In the Sudan Mirror, he wrote articles under the column, A Different Perspective on Sudanese Issues. And when he started to write for this publication, his writing also attracted a very strong readership. I remember being downcast on occasion. The Sudan Mirror weekly magazine didn't feature his articles. At the time I was at the university, and his reading was, his writings were some refreshing readings away from the academic text. Having read many of his articles, I wrote to Uncle Tim on the 28th of October 2005, suggesting he put all his writing into a book. His reply was that he was contemplating writing a book. So you can imagine the wait. It has been a long time. Tim Yak writing has been an important source of education for the young people. His wealth of knowledge on Sudanese issues is indispensable. For those of us who grew up outside South Sudan and studied histories of foreign countries, his writing has become a source of learning about our history. He is a professional and passionate journalist. He speaks and writes the truth without seeking self-glorification. Tim Yak's hallmark professionalism is summed up in these words. A real journalist must serve the truth, even if that means becoming unpopular or inviting hatred from those related by blood or political or ideological bonds. With these few remarks, I can see the master of ceremony is anxious to wave me off the stage. So I would not really go into in-depth stories of what Tim has written, and which I believe will really inspire an avid reader like every one of us. In the Jungle Chronicles, Tim writes in simple and concise prose. He narrates the event in a very debate manner, stating the facts without being discussive. The tone and the remarkable messages in this recollection are true reflection of his personality. He is a very humble person, and there are some very historic events in the book. Tim played a very pivotal role, but he avoids a posture that suggests self-congratulation. These events are the inauguration of the Radio SPLA in page 266. His initial context with an Egyptian envoy. The envoy is in quotes that paved the way for the 1988 Kokadam conference in page 311. Dr. John Garang's press conference at Tedo Village, the Ethiopian Sudanese border, and many other very important stories. There are two parts to this book. Part one is on society and culture, and part two is on war and peace. Those are very interesting stories. There is a very important point that I just not want to miss. And if there was a photocopy, I would like to distribute this copy for a full reading. Attempting the collection of Southern Sudan regional government following the Addis Ababa Agreement is rather curious. Despite the challenges of the regional government, he relies only on the efficient and effective ways that the government was run. Some of the people, though, that run that government participated in the SPLA. What then changed? What happened? The SPLM has been known for its inefficiencies and lack of governing structures. So ask yourself, what happened then? I recommend the young Chronicle to you all, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope, as many of you know, Honorable Atim Yagatim, I also highly recommend to put your hand onto that book. That means you have to buy for yourself or your relatives for Christmas gift. Okay, look, I'm trying for us to benefit today, but because of time, we may miss a golden opportunity. So I will try to alter a little bit the program. And before we do that, as I mentioned to you before, we have special guests with us. Our intellectual community, academic historians are here with us. So I would also want to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Allen. Dr. Allen is a professor at Monash University on geography. So you can see, because also we have Dr. Mohamed. Many of you know, is also with us today. Yesterday has been a very long day for Dr. Douglas H. Johnson with WENDY. They were yesterday almost to 11 o'clock in the Eastern Seven. And I believe as I traveled yesterday to my home, I came home 1 o'clock. I believe they came either 1 o'clock or past that. So I believe it's very tiresome and it's a long day. So having said that, we have Terry can say hello to your people. He organized this, he's our partner. Yes, he's the chairman of the community. Now, before other people remark, I would wanted to call Bon Machar to welcome Dr. Douglas H. Johnson to say, Doctor, these people, they here to want to learn and inspire about the past and the present. I have no problem as so long your leg can afford and your body. You can speak, but I know you cannot go more than 1 hour. That's what I know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for the chance. Before I call you to Dr. Johnson, I would like to acknowledge the traditions, land honors, past and present. And also, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Johnson and his wife, Professor WENDY, and other local South Sudanese historians, friends of South Sudanese, community leaders, all of you. Thank you for attending this important occasions, and also I would like to thank the African Media Australia, SBS Denka. I was invited to come and welcome our guest. It is actually a South Sudanese people. Here tonight, we are the reason to celebrate and appreciate Dr. Johnson, because he's a man who shown his commitment and working with South Sudan in history. As all of you know, he has been in Sudan long time ago, many years ago, I mean, and he is the eyewitness to all political events that occurred at that time. And therefore, it is very important for us as a South Sudanese, particularly students and researchers and other people who may be very interested in the history of Sudan. We have, as you know, we have a very long history back to Kush Kingdom. And today, we are going to visit those years. We have been documented by Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson is actually been working as a humanitarian advocate in South Sudan, and he also wrote the books called Ima War, and as Johnson, South Sudan most prominent living historian, and he's one of the authors which extended the knowledge of South Sudanese border with the neighboring country. Also, Dr. Johnson has written a co-author and edited many books on South Sudan, and he's here to visit friends and colleagues in Australia. During his stay here in Australia, he attached to the people of South Sudan and is going to take time to meet with a member of South Sudanese community in their diverse, but all as one. This responds to a long-standing invitation from Perth, Western Australia, based Africa World Book, and encouraged publishing company owned and run by young South Sudanese living in Australia. Dr. Johnson will be launching a Sudanese war with the third edition with updated on the recent conflict in South Sudan in 2013. As you see, I've just mentioned a few, but it will be good to hear from him. A lot of events that occurred in our country in a different period. But all in all, we are thanks and appreciate Dr. Johnson for his commitment to documenting our history that has been denied to be known by the current generations and the next generations by the Arabs. But he committed himself to documenting all the events for you as a South Sudanese to continue with your history and know the background of where you came from. It's very important, and not taking much time, I would like to welcome Dr. Johnson, a friend of South Sudanese and well-known war historian, and to come and give us a speech and give us the knowledge that he knows about South Sudan history and war and peace in a different times. So, Dr. Douglas, you're welcome to give a speech to your people. And there will be a question. And there will be a question after the finished speeches. There will be a question after the break. Then you can be willing and ask a question for him. Thank you very much, Nicola.
so a short history should not have a long introduction. I want to acknowledge the important work of two gentlemen, one who's not here and one who's here. Atem Yakatem and I served together in the Regional Ministry of Misinformation and Culture before 1983. And as the editor of South Sudan magazine, he first asked me to write short articles on the history of South Sudan. And after the most recent war, he started his weekly journal in Juba, The Pioneer, and asked me again to continue to write various articles on South Sudan, South Sudanese history. And it was through his efforts and through Peter Deng that those short pieces were collected in another book which has been on sale here, South Sudanese Past Notes and Records. Having worked myself for 15 years as a publisher of an academic, in an academic publishing firm, I know that it's no easy thing to start and keep running a specialist publishing company. And it is an extraordinary achievement by Peter to have started something here in Australia which serves a very large community of the South Sudanese diaspora, but also serves a much larger community of those persons here in Australia and abroad who are interested to learn more about South Sudan. I would not be here today if it was not for the work of Peter. Now, when I approached the problem or the task of writing a general history of South Sudan, there were two important aspects that I wanted to address. One was to place South Sudan within the broader context of African history. When I started my interest in South Sudanese history as a student at Makerere University back in 1969, where many of my classmates were South Sudanese refugees, the South Sudan was more or less ignored, or was in fact considered to be so remote and isolated to have not participated in any of the great events of African history before the onset of colonialism. And in many respects, it is still written about as a remote and isolated country. But the advances of research in African history in the region, as well as broader African history, helps us now to overcome that particular stereotype. South Sudan is the home of numerous languages which are shared or part of the grand language group of the Nilo-Saharan languages, and it could not possibly have the numerous representatives of those languages if it was an isolated and remote territory. There have also been advances in archaeology, not much in South Sudan itself, it's quite true, but archaeologists are beginning to look at the Nile Basin and the Nile Valley in a broader way, a broader perspective, and not just looking at the monuments of ancient Egypt. Now, for instance, the excavations in Kerma in northern Sudan, one of the great kingdoms of antiquity, they uncovered a circle of buried cattle skulls, a part of a sacrifice of some sort. And what did those cattle skulls look like? They had horns, of course, but their horns were not natural. Their horns were like this. And I spoke to an archaeologist, and he said, we don't know what this means. We don't know why they did this. And I suggested that he might go and read the books of Evans Pritchard and Godfrey Leonhardt to find out. What that means is not that South Sudanese were as far north as Kerma, or the ancestors of South Sudanese were necessarily in Kerma training the horns of their cattle, what it means is that South Sudanese are part of a broader tradition, a broader cultural archive of the Nile Basin, where other people are also taking those aspects of that cultural archive and using them in some way. The work of one of my supervisors, Christopher Eric, looking at languages and making inferences about the meanings of the spiritual life and the economic life and the social life of different communities by looking at their language, the history of their languages, also shows that South Sudanese people are very much part of a broader group of African communities in Northeast Africa. So that was the first thing, which was to try to put South Sudan as what I referred to as the missing piece in the jigsaw puzzle of African history, to try to place it back in African history where it had been ignored. The second point was that I wanted to bring in some aspect of the indigenous histories of South Sudanese, not just looking at the colonial record, though I have done that and that is important, but looking at the way in which South Sudanese have described their own past. Now, some of these may be direct testimony. For instance, when I was doing my research on the Nuer prophets, I was able to talk to people who were witnesses to some of the events or who knew witnesses to those events. And that I would refer to as oral testimony rather than oral tradition. But then there are the indigenous traditions, some things that are very often referred to or dismissed as myths, because they don't refer to specific events, possibly not even to specific peoples. There is a cite in the book, an article that was now, I just calculated, it was published more than 40 years ago, by the anthropologist Godfrey Lienhardt, who taught anthropology in Oxford, and who was known as an anthropologist of the Dinka and the Anwak. And he wrote an article called Getting Your Own Back, and he described a cycle of myths that are well known among the Anwak, the Shilluk, the Acholi, the Jurluo, the Nuer, and the Dinka. And it's called The Myth of the Spear and the Bead. Now, some of you may have heard of it, or may have heard the contents. It describes how a man borrowed a spear from his neighbor to go hunting and lost the spear. And when he wanted to replace it, his neighbor said, "No, I gave you one spear, I want my spear, you must get my spear back." And the man had to chase the animal that he had tried to kill to find the spear and eventually bring it back. Then the man who had borrowed the spear was beading a necklace, and the child of the man who owned the spear swallowed that bead. And the man who owned the bead said, "I want my own bead back. I don't want to wait for it to appear." And he insisted on cutting open the stomach of the child to retrieve the bead. Now, the point of these stories is that the neighbors could no longer live together, having insisted so much on getting their very own back. And Godfrey Lienhardt concluded the common moral theme of these myths is that getting your very own back, a kind of reciprocation without exchange, leads to the permanent alienation of neighbors so that they can never again live together as members of the same community. And I end the book with that quotation because of its relevance to South Sudan today. Now, it won't surprise you that as a historian I disagree with Tim Costello. We mustn't forget. It's not that we mustn't forget because we must nurture bitterness within our hearts. It is because precisely this type of myth, this oral tradition, records conflict and the consequences of conflict. And we must always remember the consequences of conflict if we are to overcome them. So, forgive perhaps, but you have to know what you're forgiving, and you've got to remember your history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Douglas H. Johnson, for the brief short history we have done. I ask all of you, the South Sudan, a new history for a young nation. There are a few copies outside there. Please, you can go and buy them. The South Sudan Past Notes and Apanal handbooks, all those books written by Douglas H. Johnson, there you can go and buy and have more information from there. Now, I am aware there is one of the gifts that would have to be given to Dr. H. Johnson, and the mother is going back to look after the kid. So I'm asking, it's a bit informal, we would have to do it at the end of the day or end of the program. So I ask Madam to come forward, and I think Terry Young, you can come and present where is it, Elizabeth? Oh, Peter, yes. You can come if you want to present this, I think, yep. Where is the key? Yep. Thank you. We ask you once more, Dr. Douglas. Yes. To come and receive this gift. It's kind of a traditional kind of a clothes. It's a honor for your great work for us.
Yes, oh, it's a lower.
Awesome.
What are the horns like? He's a cow image.
Oh, amazing. Your books has the horn of cow, and the clothes look like there is a cow.
I just want to explain a little bit about the gifts that we are presented now. This is a certificate of award from Denga Community Union of Victoria. We have preferred to give it to you as acknowledge the work we have been done for South Sudanese people. So we give it to you as a happiness and appreciation. And also this, what you have put in your bag is actually is contain the mark of the cow. As you know, as a Denka, we believe in cow because cow is very important animal for us as a Denka or as a South Sudanese. And that's why we have to give it this as a knowledge that you have done something good for us, and we have to give you our traditional gifts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now you can have a seat. Okay. Thank you, Ted. And the rest?
I think the way we did it yesterday in the East, there were questions after Professor Dr. Douglas. We are not going to deprive you of that. The reason is why Africa organized this, or Professor Douglas, a year and a half ago, was to come and meet the community face to face. Because when we first made an effort of getting the Upper Nile Provincial books, the reason was that nothing much had been written about the country. And we were not aware of some of the things. So we acknowledge your presence and be patient. Today is your day. As people in the western suburb, the people in the east had their ones. And I was very grateful that the lower community were ready to host the program in partnership with Africa Wellwood. We try to approach the South Sudanese community. I'm not betraying them, but nothing has happened. This should have been hosted by the community. I try also to approach, yes, truth has to be said. I try to approach the federation because one would wonder why did the lawyer hold the program on behalf of the South Sudanese? The federation were not ready. This great man has done a lot of job for the community. We know that borders have not been demarcated, and it is our responsibility as young people of South Sudan to know more. So give your time to listen to Douglas and Professor Wendy, his wife. She's here. She has written quite a few books on the people of Udu. So to those who are here tonight, we acknowledge your presence, but be patient with us. So get your questions ready, and we will answer after some time.
Thank you, Rual, for those few remarks. We also thank African World Book for their dedication and partners. So now, before I call Professor Wendy, we will call Arok Aleu, and we do know Arok dedicated himself to write from the book, short stories and long books. So we now welcome Arok Aleu.
Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. As a speaker, I think I'm tired down there. I think maybe everybody is like that. First of all, I would like to give my thanks to the African World Book for the great job they're doing on our behalf. And I'm thanking Professor Douglas. All of us who are sitting here, most of us, we are reading your book, and it is really very important for us, encouraging us. My work today is very different from the rest of the authors. I'm writing in Dinka. So first of all, I would like everyone to say to somebody near him, say good luck. So the way to in Punjab or in Tongyang, you say Alo, or in Nuer say Malay or like that. So my book is this one here. It's just a language. This is the basic of the language, Dinka. So my name is Harokalu. My background, I have a degree in social sciences. That's the brief information I will give you about myself. I will be brief about the book, why I write the book in Tongyang. Why I write the book in Tongyang? When I came here in Australia some years back, somebody asked me, do you think in Mwanjam or do you think in English? And I asked myself, I asked him, what do you mean? And he said, I asked you, do you think in Mwanjam or in English? I couldn't understand the question at that time. 5 years later on, I started to understand the question why that guy asked me, do you think in English or in Dinka? That question is the reason why I write the book in Dinka. So what I found there, when I write this book, in ethical fact, I found myself translating English into Dinka. So why I write the book, that's why I'm going in now. Why I write the book in Pongyang. As we are here in Australia, we have the kids. Most of us, in most cases, we spend most of our time in school or in what? Or in other public areas. Where there is no Pongyang, where there is no Nuer or Shuluk or Sholi. So you're speaking either the English language or other public languages. So my main idea to write a book in Dinka is to pass down the knowledge of our people to our kids. Pongyang is a very important language, and it is very accommodative language too. Any English word or French word or whatever language word might be a Pongyang word. In this book, when you go there, you find some Arabic word like Masura. It is Arabic. It's not our language. Ganun. It is not our language, but it's there in our language. This book, it is started from the basic, from a kid in Pongyang or the letters to the highest of the language. So the main purpose of writing it, to show the Dinka speakers and to help the Dinka, so the Dinka speakers, the language is more important. The title of the book is Thongdupei. That's the title of the book. If you translate it in English, the nearest word in English, the nearest word is your language is important or your language is special. Thongdupei to me, even though you learn so many languages, you learn so many cultures, your language is still very special because it connects you with your culture. When somebody born, when the mother born a child, the first thing the child do to communicate with a mom is to cry. The second thing to do is to have mother, what we call it Thongdupei. That one is a kind of communication. So in this book, you found a very basic language called Pongyang. As we speak, you know this guy called Jubtaruai Malo. Jubtaruai Malo is the founder of Dinka Akir. In Pongyang there is Akir Yao. In Dinka, there is what we call a Akir Yao and a Akir Bel. The breathing letters and the letters which are breathing, they are basic. So the challenge in Dinka language now is the new system. How to know writing Akir Yao and Akir Bel. And that's what I'm addressing in the book. So if you are willing to learn Dinka, this book is being written for everybody, the beginners and those people who have knowledge in Dinka. So if you are willing to learn from them, this book might be one of the best books among the others, because there are so many books from them. And as we know, as the Dinka speakers, from them is not one. It's not. It is one language, but it has got a lot of diversity in it. Like, for example, there are Dinka part called word queen. There are Dinkas. So there are some groups start the word queen with queen, and others start word key with key, and that all of that one is Dinka language. And that's what I have read in this book. To make it short, because I can't go more, because we have been sitting here for long. So that's the meaning of the book. And I'm writing more books. And I'm really encouraging a lot of people in Dinka Because no matter what you learn other languages, your language is still your language. And thank you.
Thank you, thank you. The book is accessible. You can have it whether you are in USA. It's on Amazon. It's on with African World Books and other partners. I think it's good to read our language so that you can teach our kids. Thank you for that. Now we are coming nearly to the last speaker. Before we have questions. To Dr. Douglas, I would want to ask LME in welcoming Dr. Wendy. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for making a moment or two for me to reflect on one or two points. I came to know something of the Eastern African countries because my father spent time in Uganda in the mid-1950s. This struck my imagination, his pictures, his stories, his letters. And later, I found myself studying social anthropology in Oxford, not very long before Professor Evans Pritchard was due to retire. He taught me. I read his books on the Nur, the Zambia, the Anuak, his writings on the Shilluk, his writings on the peoples of the southern Blue Nile. And eventually it turned out that I was offered a job in the University of Khartoum. I taught Sudanese students not only about Sudan, mainly the northern cities, but also the south. I was involved, therefore, in transferring the things that Evans Pritchard had seen, described, interpreted. I was transferring those scenes, those interpretations, that kind of imagination as to how to try and understand a society from the inside to Sudanese students. There were a few from the south, but it was a mixed audience, a mixed body of students with some non-Sudanese altogether. But that was my sort of moulding of a sense of the southern Sudan and its peoples. I wasn't able to do research in the south because of the war bubbling up in the 1960s. But later on, I was able to study in the Blue Nile, as has been mentioned, people in the Kurmuk district. There are several languages spoken there, of which I concentrated on one, but I was interested in the patterns of small groups in the hills, because this pattern of patchwork of small languages extended into Ethiopia. Later I had the opportunity of conducting research on the Ethiopian side of the border in the 70s. This was all before Douglas and I actually met. So here we have a coming together of history and anthropological experience in relation to the peoples and the history of the Southern Sudan. It was after we were married and had two small children. We spent a year together in Juba. Our daughter went to school, a little school for 4-year-olds in Juba, and started herself learning Juba Arabic. The world is a very open place, and it is for that reason that the project of African World Books, the work of Peter Deng and his colleagues and others, not only in the publishing of books, but those who work in the radio industry, SBS Inca, for example. But the spreading of human contact through ideas, through memories, through books is terribly important. Here we are in Australia. Most of us in this room have some idea of the Southern Sudan, or at least the Sudan or Northeast Africa. We think about it quite a lot all the time. And it is terribly important that contact and imagination and exchange is kept up. And I would like just to express the admiration all of us visitors have of the work that has been done within this particular community from the diaspora, and in such a distance away, you are keeping in touch to some extent. Very good luck with what you're doing here in the diaspora, and our thoughts and even prayers are with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, as Peter said, it's a time for interaction. I would warn you, if you can ask questions, don't explain, and I'm optimistic if you can ask one question, so that other people can have questions. Instead of you having 2 questions, 3 questions, have only one and ask questions. So I will open the floor. Those who like to ask, especially, we give questions to Dr. Douglas H. Johnson. If you have a question you want to ask, please ask the question. Just say your name and the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson, for giving us this opportunity to listen to you today. We have been thinking where we could get this great man to talk to us directly. And also, I'm thanking the other writers like John Adore and Arok. And importantly, I was impressed when Sarah was really presenting the work he has done here in Melbourne on the Sudanese who are here. So my question is to Dr. Douglas. Dr. Douglas, I have read your books with great interest, and I have understood that there are some other things that I would like you also to explain. The first one is you refer to, you say that there was a quote from somebody called Palmerston in Britain in mid-90s that nature have no permanent friends, allies, and they only have permanent interests. So you are referring to the 90s trend about PLM and American backing Khartoum because of their interests, and then you went on to where I want to ask the question on. You say, looking beyond that immediate cycle, South Sudan will need to cultivate good relations with those countries which have interests in the South. But to do so, it will need to understand what those interests are, always recognizing that the majority of nations will be neither friends nor enemy. So my question is, I have been listening to so many things that American interest was not taken on board. And South Sudan, a forgotten friend America, he has gone to China, and this now there is allegation that America has been not supporting South Sudan because interests are not taken on. This South Sudan, according to your analysis, which you have already observed in Sudan, have taken on the interests of any nation. Or we want to know how could we take the interests of other nations later on. We need elaboration on that. Another one is, I want you to say something about the 1954 deal, Booth deal document. Yes. And if you have time, the closed district ordinance, which always made us argue here, South Sudan was once have a passport, another nation has to be given passport to come to South Sudan. If you can elaborate on that, it would be good. Thank you.
I'll try my best. The sound system still is difficult to understand. There are two questions about what is the American interest in South Sudan. And to be honest, I don't know. You've had three different administrations dealing with South Sudan. The Republican administration of George W. Bush was instrumental in getting the negotiations that led to South Sudan's independence started. I believe that much of that was a humanitarian interest, but there were obviously potential other interests of the strategic importance of the interest of the Middle East, also trying to find different sources of oil that didn't go through Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Whether those were significant interests that led to the what I would say my criticism of the Danforth report and the CPA was that it mischaracterized the conflict in Sudan at that time. It focused only on what would have been called in the 1960s the Southern problem, and did not realize that there was a wider war being fought in Sudan at the time negotiations in IGAD began. It was not being fought just in South Sudan. It was not being fought just between South Sudan and Khartoum. There were other parts of the Sudan that were involved as integral parts of the SPLA, SPLM, fighting for quite a different outcome than was achieved. And of course there were South Sudanese on the side of Khartoum fighting other South Sudanese. So I felt that the IGAD negotiations were based on false premises, which might be one reason why there is still war in Sudan, as well as an outbreak of violence in South Sudan. What is my view in regard to the current civil war? You've just heard part of that. But I think a substantial cause of the current conflict is a failure of the South Sudan government to make use of the interim period. It was only 6 years, which, as we found out, is a very short time, but there did not seem to be a coherent idea of what the government of South Sudan wanted an independent South Sudan to look like in the aftermath of 22 years of civil war. Everything seemed to have been focused on the referendum. There was the fiction that both Khartoum and Juba were working for the same end, which was a united Sudan, but they had diametrically opposed ideas of what a united Sudan should look like. But because the SPLM was committed through the Machakos Protocol to promoting the idea of a united Sudan, there could be no public and obvious discussion in South Sudan, either in the government or among the public, about what an independent South Sudan should look like. And there was no attempt, no systematic attempt to look at the trauma of that war and try to bring about reconciliation between communities that had been set against each other as a result of the way the war was fought. It wasn't just Khartoum that used militias. So did the SPLA, so did the different factions of the SPLM, SPLA, and it was the civilian communities that suffered. So there was an important process of negotiation, of reconciliation and reconstruction that had to be done at the local level, but there also had to be a reform of the SPLA an acknowledgement of the damage the SPLA had done to civilian communities. That was not done, and that, I think, is a large part of the outbreak of the war in 2013. Somebody seems to have asked me, what is the basis of Nung Deng's prophecies? Well, according to Nung Deng, he was speaking directly the words of Deng. He was inspired by Quoth, by God. What was he saying at the time? I've said this before in the community meeting yesterday. You can approach any sort of prophet or prophecy in three ways. You can approach them as a believer, you can approach them as a skeptic, or you can take the middle option and approach them as a historian, somewhere in between belief and skepticism, trying to figure out what the prophet was addressing, what was the audience the prophet was addressing in his own time, and what were the issues that the prophet was addressing in his own time. And my interpretation of that, which may not be everybody else's, is that in the 19th century, as a result of the expansion of newer communities east of the Nile, and their incorporation of a large number of other communities that were already there, Dinka, Anwak, and others, that the cohesion of Nuer society was facing a major challenge, especially through the continuation of raiding. Because as Nuer communities began to absorb different other communities that were already there, another historian has said that in fact this was a process more of people changing who they were rather than changing where they were. People who were one-time Dinka became Nuer, people who were one-time Anwak became Nuer. Nuer began marrying Dinka, and if other groups of Nuer started raiding their neighbors or their relatives, they were going to create feuds within Nuer society. So much of what Nung Deng was saying at the time was aimed at Nuer communities. He was very hostile to feuds, to raiding. And this is something that came as a surprise to me, but it is something that I was told by many of the elders among the Lao Nuer, but I found it confirmed not only among some of the Nyawang Dinka and Dinka neighbors, I found it confirmed in some of the British records. So that's my interpretation of what the basis of Nung Deng's prophecies were. And if that interpretation is correct, that helps to explain why his prophecies resonate so much today when there has been a more widespread violence and a tearing apart of internal communities. And I do not know how you get out of that problem, because so many South Sudanese want to be leaders, and they think only in terms of occupying a position. There has to be, at some point, a genuine conversation at all levels, but especially at the government level, of some sort of constitutional convention or consultation of the sort that was avoided back in 2011. There has to be an open discussion of how South Sudanese wish to be governed, and how they can see the possibility, what is the most, how they can produce an effective and stable system of government. There have been a lot of discussions about federalism, but so far as far as I'm aware, most of these discussions have not been about the functions of federalism. As Boni Mandiri, when he formed the Federal Party back in 1958, produced a 2 or 3 page document which was a sketch, but he made it quite clear the central government would have certain powers, the state would have certain powers, and then there would be certain concurrent powers. Now at that time he was thinking of two states, North and South Sudan. But the issue is the same for South Sudan. Rather than saying we need this number of states, 10, 23, 25, 32, I don't know what is the current number. What was that? 34, okay. It was really to look at how the provinces and the states were created in the first place. Now, if you look at the colonial period, the main concern that the Anglo-Egyptian condominium government had was security. So how do you create administrative units that produce that security? And one way was when there were groups of people who were in conflict, instead of putting them in different provinces under different governors, you put them under one province, under one government, one administration, so that those conflicts could be addressed without creating more conflicts. I'll just give you an example. Around about 1909 or 1910, Mongala province and Upper Nile province drew a line and said, this is the boundary between the Nuer and the Dinka. Every time there was a conflict that went across that boundary, whether it was Nuer coming into Dinka or Dinka coming into Nuer, the two governors came into conflict, saying, I'm defending my people, your people are causing this problem. And finally, the government in Khartoum said, this isn't going to work. We're putting that part of Mongala, all that Dinka from Bor, Congo, Duke, we're putting that all in Upper Nile because that is how the conflict can be controlled and solved. Part of the reason we have the RBA issue now is that because not just the Nok Dinka, but the Twitch and the Ruang were complaining about the Hummer coming and raiding them, and the Wow government was so distant that they didn't even know the names of the rivers that were in that area. It was decided, well, if this is the problem, let the governor of Kordofan deal with it. Put them all in one province. Now, eventually, the Ruang and the Twitch were put into different provinces, leaving the Nok. But that was the reason why these people were all put together. There was a conflict. How was the best way to solve it? Put it under the same administration. Don't divide it between two different or three different administrations. I think that's a lesson that South Sudan has to look at and think very carefully if it is applicable now to the situation on the ground in South Sudan. Now that's the issue of governance. I did mention in the questions earlier the importance of reconciliation between communities. Actually, South Sudanese know how to do this at a local level, because one of the principal efforts, or one of the principal reasons, whether in the old native administration, there were these regular inter-community meetings. They were called intertribal conferences. We have records of them in the National Archives in Juba. Not all of them, but quite a few. In fact, it's quite surprising to get a record of the minutes of an intertribal meeting between the Murle and the Nuer from the early 50s, and how they reconciled how they approached their differences. What was the differences? The differences were obviously over cattle and water, grazing and water for cattle. How did they deal with that in these big meetings? The Wunlit Conference of 1999 was based on that formula. Now, what is absent from that? Everybody knows in South Sudan how to do these meetings, how to organize them, how they're supposed to operate. But what is missing right now is the authority that guarantees that the resolutions of these meetings are implemented. In the past, that was the civil administration. That was the province administrators. When I first came to South Sudan in 1975, well, actually it wasn't when I first came to South Sudan, but when I came to South Sudan, Upper Nile in 1975, there were a series of meetings like this that were being called to resolve issues arising from the recent Anyanya War. Because of the Amnesty Act, nobody could be prosecuted for stealing cattle, stealing a girl, or killing, but there were still issues about activities during the Anyanya War that were then being looked at and by large tribal meetings that the province government and the regional government were guaranteeing. So you need that authority. I won't say a neutral authority, because it's government and government's not neutral, but it has to be an objective authority that can guarantee the implementation of some sort of resolution from a meeting. I think that's all I can really say. Oh, somebody said, if UN and IGAD came to me and asked me how to bring peace to South Sudan, well, the UN and IGAD have not come to me, and I doubt that they ever will. But if they did, I'd probably say much the same as I've just said to you.
Thank you so much. That's really a very good end. A final remark, I need you to give these people the credit. If Majak Kakot is here, Awan Paul, and Chol Grant, these people, they need technical support, they have been here. Please give them a hand. Without them, we will not do it. Thank you all, and much of the credit to our authors and our special guests and Dr. Douglas and Wendy for this great evening. It was not only a history, it was also a reflection. Thank you all partners of African World Books, Initiative of Change, John York, thank you, the Nuer community, the GM, Paul Mashar, and many others. Thank you, and the entire